Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a fierce HOA queen dares to crush a couple's dream garden with concrete and power plays, she awakens a storm she never saw coming. Betrayal, sabotage, and an epic legal battle unfold. But in this war, it's not just land at stake. It's pride, love, and ultimate revenge. My name is Matt Harper. I'm 39 years old, an architect by trade, and I live with my wife Beth on a beautiful 2-acre property just outside the tight little neighborhood of Maple Hill. It's the kind of place you work your whole life to own. Rolling green lawns, tall old oaks that throw shade across the yard, and, most importantly, no one breathing down your neck about how to live. We were never part of the Maple Hill HOA, and thank God for that. Our land technically touches their boundaries, but we were grandfathered out, a little independent island they couldn't control. Beth, though, is the real gem of the property. She's a landscape designer and not just a hobbyist. She's been featured in magazines, interviewed on local TV, invited to speak at gardening expos. Her gardens are breathtaking. The front yard is a curated masterpiece of rare roses, perfectly sculpted shrubs, a stone fountain, delicate walkways lined with lavender, and small marble statues peeking from behind flower beds. People sometimes slow their cars just to stare. Most of the neighbors love it, or at least they used to. We kept to ourselves, happy to stay off the HOA radar, but Maple Hill has its queen, Karen, president of the HOA, 50-something, always in pastel cardigans and chunky necklaces, with that sharp little smirk she wears like armor. For the most part, we stayed out of each other's business. Sure, I caught her giving us side eyes at times, and Beth said Karen had made a few passive-aggressive remarks about neighborhood standards at community events, but we didn't pay it much mind. That was until one Tuesday afternoon. Beth was pulling into our driveway, her old Subaru creaking as she maneuvered carefully along the edge where our lot meets the road. I was inside at my desk reviewing floor plans when I noticed through the window that Karen had crossed the boundary. Literally, she was striding up to Beth with that purposeful, clipped gait, blonde bob bouncing, tablet in hand like a holy relic. I saw Beth roll down her window, smile politely. But Karen didn't come with pleasantries. I stepped onto the porch just in time to hear it. You know, Karen began in that syrupy, fake polite tone. Your husband parks a little too close to the road. It's disrupting the visual flow of the street. We expect residents to maintain the aesthetic of the neighborhood, even if technically you're not part of the association. Beth, bless her, gave her best professional smile. Karen, we appreciate the input, but we're on our own land. Maybe focus on what's inside your own fences. That was it. A simple, firm pushback, but I saw the flicker in Karen's eyes, the one that said she wasn't used to hearing no. Her lips pressed together, her grip tightened on her tablet, and without another word, she spun around and marched off, heels clicking like gunshots against the pavement. Beth walked into the house, shaking her head. She's going to make trouble, you know. I tried to brush it off. Let her try. She can't touch us. But inside, something gnawed at me, because you could practically feel it in the air. This wasn't over. And in a neighborhood like Maple Hill, where control was everything, a woman like Karen wouldn't let a little independence go unchallenged. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the sun slips softly through the curtains and the birds outside sing their little concerts. I was still half asleep, tucked under the covers, when I felt Beth stir beside me, then a distant rumble. At first, I thought maybe it was just a passing truck on the main road, but the sound grew louder, a deep, grinding, mechanical growl that didn't fade. Beth sat up first, brushing hair from her face, brow furrowing. "Matt, do you hear that?" I blinked myself awake and swung my legs over the side of the bed. We both moved toward the window, almost in unison, pulling aside the curtain, and that's when my stomach dropped. A massive concrete truck, one of those hulking mixers, was parked right at the edge of our garden. Bright orange cones lined our driveway, and several men in HOA-marked vests were setting up wooden frames over Beth's flower beds. Thick, gray hoses snaked across the lawn, trailing back to the truck where the drum had already started to spin. What the? Beth was already halfway down the stairs before I could stop her. I grabbed a hoodie, slipped into shoes, and ran after her. Outside, the morning was suddenly full of motion and noise. Workers barked orders at each other, positioning equipment, unrolling more tubing, hammering stakes into the ground. And at the center of it all, standing calmly like a general surveying her troops, was Karen. She had on a cream-colored pantsuit, a pair of large sunglasses, and held a coffee cup daintily between two fingers. "Karen!" Beth's voice sliced through the chaos. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen turned with a cool little smile. "Oh, good morning, Beth. Just a little neighborhood improvement project. We received multiple complaints that your garden encroaches too close to the road. Quite a violation of safety standards, I'm sure you understand. Plus, the board authorized some aesthetic improvements. This will all be taken care of shortly." Beth's face went red, hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You can't be serious. This is private property. You have no right." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Actually, dear, we do. It's called a beautification mandate. Maybe next time you'll remember to be polite." I stepped between them, trying to calm things down, but it was too late. Beth lunged forward, shoving past me, grabbing Karen's shoulder. Karen let out a dramatic gasp, twisting around, spilling her coffee onto the walkway. For a split second, both women froze, and then they were at each other's throats. It was chaos. Beth grabbed at Karen's arm, and Karen shrieked, pushing back hard. They staggered across the lawn, stumbling through the flower beds, crushing petals underfoot. One of the workers muttered, "Oh, hell," and pulled out his phone to start filming. I tried to wedge myself between them, but they were locked in, fists gripping fabric, hair pulled, harsh words flying. "Stay off my land," Beth snarled, her eyes blazing. "You'll regret this," Karen hissed back, voice trembling with fury. And then, the wail of sirens. I whipped my head toward the road to see two patrol cars speeding up, blue and red lights flashing. They skidded to a stop, doors flying open, officers spilling out. "Hands off, now!" one of them barked. Beth let go instantly, backing up, chest heaving. Karen, ever the performer, clutched at her blouse and staggered dramatically, pointing at Beth. "She assaulted me. I want to press charges." Beth's face crumpled in disbelief. "You started this. You're the one destroying our home." But the officers were already separating them, talking to each of us in turn, notebooks out. The workers quietly shut off the mixer, and Karen's smug little smirk returned as she whispered to one of the officers. 10 minutes later, they handed Beth a slip of paper, a restraining order request. Karen had filed an emergency petition. As the truck rumbled away and the crowd dispersed, Beth stood there silently, staring at the paper in her hands. Then, without a word, she turned, walked into the house, and shut the door. I followed, calling her name, but by the time I got inside, she had already vanished into the bedroom, the door locked. The next morning, she was gone. A note sat on the kitchen table. "Matt, I need space. Handle this. Please." Her phone was turned off, her clothes gone. I sank into a chair, staring at the wrecked garden outside, the mangled beds, the gray patches of wet concrete staining the grass. Alone now, facing down the storm, I realized this was no longer just a neighborly feud. This was war. For the first time in years, the house felt cold. Not just quiet, empty. I sat at the kitchen table for what must have been an hour, Beth's note still lying in front of me, rereading her words over and over. She was gone. She'd walked out needing space, needing time, and here I was, left alone in a wrecked house, surrounded by wrecked land, with no idea where to even begin. But as the morning light crept across the floor, something inside me hardened. If Beth couldn't be here, then I would handle this. For her, for us, for everything we'd built. The first thing I did was grab my phone and start taking photos. Every square inch of that destroyed garden, the wet concrete crusting over my wife's carefully laid stone paths, the crushed rose bushes, the snapped trellises, the shards of her delicate garden sculptures poking out like broken bones. I captured all of it. Up close, wide shots, angles from the house, from the road. I recorded a video walking through the mess, narrating every bit of damage. I could practically hear Beth's voice in my head. Document everything, Matt. Then I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Gina, an old friend from college, now a sharp-witted civil attorney who didn't suffer fools lightly. I laid out the situation, my voice tight, and she immediately scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. "Bring every scrap of evidence you have," she told me. "And Matt, this is going to get ugly. Be ready." While I waited for the appointment, I went to the neighbors. I knew some of them were HOA loyalists, but not all. I knocked on doors, explained what happened, and sure enough, a few sympathetic faces emerged. Mrs. Langley next door whispered that she'd seen the trucks arrive that morning and knew they weren't supposed to be there. Mr. Owens across the street admitted he'd overheard Karen bragging last week about fixing the Harper's Garden problem once and for all. They were scared, hesitant, but they agreed to write statements, maybe even testify if needed. Meanwhile, Karen was spinning her own story. That afternoon, a post appeared on the neighborhood Facebook page. A long, self-righteous rant claiming that the Harper's Garden had been in violation for months, that the concrete work was part of a safety improvement, and that Beth had attacked her in a fit of rage. The comments section filled with her loyal supporters, all parroting her lines. I gritted my teeth. Gina was blunt when I met her. "This is more than just a property dispute, Matt. It's personal. Karen wants to destroy you. Your reputation, your finances, your standing. But she's sloppy. We'll hit her on every front. Trespass, vandalism, emotional distress, improper HOA action, you name it." That night, I sat alone in the house, the windows dark, the garden outside eerily quiet under the moonlight. I wondered where Beth was, if she was okay, if she knew how determined I was to fight for her, even if she couldn't be here beside me right now. I clenched my fists. This wasn't just about repairing a garden or saving face. This was about standing up against a bully, about showing the whole damn neighborhood that we wouldn't be trampled. I didn't know exactly how we'd win yet, but one thing was clear: the war had begun. It was exactly 7 days after Beth had disappeared when I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. I rushed to the front door, heart pounding, and there she was, stepping out of her Subaru, sunglasses on, her hair tied back in a sharp, no-nonsense ponytail. She looked different, determined, energized. She was carrying a thick folder under one arm, her shoulders squared. I opened the door, barely getting out a breathless "Beth," before she held up a hand. "Come inside, Matt. We've got work to do." Inside, we sat at the dining table, and she spread out a collection of documents, photographs, and official-looking reports. "I went to Tallahassee," she began, voice steady. "Met with 2 state-level civil engineers, a lawyer specializing in HOA cases, and an environmental consultant. I needed to know if there was any leverage we could use beyond just the vandalism." I watched, stunned, as she laid out blueprints, zoning maps, and drainage reports, things I hadn't even known she had access to. She tapped one particular document. "See this? The Maple Hill HOA has been doing unapproved improvements for years. They've laid concrete paths, poured extra parking pads, and restructured common areas without city permits. Worse, they've been ignoring the land's natural drainage patterns." I frowned. "Drainage?" Beth gave a tight smile. "The entire HOA sits on low-lying, poorly drained ground. It's only been manageable because of the green spaces and natural runoff systems, most of which they've been paving over." She pointed at a highlighted section. "If we can prove their work has made the neighborhood vulnerable to flooding, we can escalate this into something far bigger than just our garden." I felt a flicker of hope stir in my chest. Beth's eyes hardened. "We're not just going after Karen for the concrete, Matt. We're going after the whole rotten structure she's built. I want to hold her and the HOA board accountable for everything." She slid a list across the table: civil lawsuit for trespass and property destruction, emotional distress claims, report to the city's code enforcement on unpermitted HOA projects, environmental complaint regarding water mismanagement. I couldn't help but grin. My wife hadn't just spent the week licking her wounds. She'd gone into full battle mode. "Beth," I said quietly, "you're incredible." She gave me a tired but fierce smile. "They thought pouring concrete would break me, Matt, but they forgot. I'm a designer. I build things. And now, we're going to build a case that buries them." For the first time in days, I felt the weight in my chest lift. Not completely. We were still up against an entire HOA machine with Karen at its ruthless helm. But this was no longer a desperate solo fight. Beth was back. With a plan, with fire in her eyes, and with every intention of making Karen regret ever stepping foot on our land. I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Let's take them down." Beth squeezed back, her expression sharp and resolved. "Oh, we will." The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of place where small-town politics met cold legal steel. Beth and I sat side by side at the long, polished table, her papers spread neatly in front of her, my hands clenched on my lap. Across from us, Karen sat stiffly with her team of attorneys, her hair perfectly coiffed, lips pressed tight in a thin, smug line. She didn't look at us directly. No, that was beneath her, but I could feel the tension radiating off her like a coiled wire. Our lawyer, Gina, leaned in and murmured, "Don't flinch, no matter what they throw. We've got the stronger hand." The judge entered, a tall, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who wasted no time. "Let's get to the facts." Karen's lawyers pounced first, laying out a twisted version of events. According to them, our garden was a public safety risk, a visual blight on the neighborhood, a violation of zoning ordinances, and the HOA, out of pure civic duty, had merely intervened to prevent further noncompliance. Karen, they claimed, had been assaulted by my wife when she tried to supervise the correction efforts. I nearly barked out a laugh at the word supervise, but Beth squeezed my arm, keeping me still. Then it was our turn. Gina stood and calmly, methodically presented everything we had. Photos of the garden before the destruction, video footage of the concrete trucks crossing onto our land, neighbor testimonies saying they'd witnessed Karen directing the entire operation, even internal HOA emails obtained through a subpoena that clearly showed Karen pushing the board to deal with the Harpers once and for all. But the real gut punch came when Beth stood and presented the environmental reports. She explained, with the calm precision of someone who knows her subject, how the HOA's unauthorized construction projects had altered the neighborhood's natural drainage, how the paving and concrete had blocked water flow, and how the next heavy rains could cause catastrophic flooding not just for us, but for the entire HOA community. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as Beth spoke, flipping through the expert reports we'd submitted. Karen's lawyers tried to object, sputtering about irrelevant environmental concerns, but the judge silenced them with a sharp look. By the end of the session, Karen had lost her smirk. She sat rigid, fingers tapping nervously on the table, whispering furiously to her lawyers as the judge announced that the case would proceed to a full hearing. No quick dismissals, no quiet backroom settlements. As we left the courtroom, Gina gave us a small, satisfied nod. "They're on the ropes," she murmured. "We just have to push them over." Beth slipped her arm through mine as we walked down the steps. "Do you feel it, Matt?" she whispered. I turned to her, feeling the electric pulse in my chest. "What?" She smiled faintly. "The shift. The moment they realized they picked the wrong people to mess with." The rain began 2 days after the courtroom showdown. Not a gentle drizzle, but a relentless downpour, hammering the streets and rooftops, turning gutters into mini rivers. I stood at our kitchen window, watching the water bead and raced down the glass when my phone buzzed on the counter. "Matt, you need to see this," came Gina's voice. "Turn on the local news." I grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV. There it was. Live coverage. Maple Hill, the HOA neighborhood that sat smugly next to ours, was turning into a swamp. Reporters stood on sidewalks now underwater, pointing at front lawns half submerged in muddy pools. Residents in raincoats and boots struggled to wade through flooded driveways. Cars sat half drowned in sagging garages. Beth appeared behind me, her brow creased, arms folded. "It started," she murmured. The environmental reports hadn't been exaggerating. All that unauthorized concrete, all those paved-over drainage lines the HOA had smugly added to improve the look of the neighborhood, had nowhere for the stormwater to go. Our own property, thanks to Beth's careful landscaping and proper drainage, stayed mostly dry, but Maple Hill was drowning under the weight of its own negligence. The next day, things got worse. Emergency crews were called in to pump out water from the worst-hit basements. Homeowners were in uproar, demanding answers from the HOA board. City officials arrived, shaking their heads, asking pointed questions about permits and construction approvals. And in the center of the chaos was Karen. We saw her once, pacing furiously on the sidewalk, umbrella snapping in the wind, phone clamped to her ear as she barked into it, her usually perfect hair a wet mess. Her empire was cracking. Beth and I watched from a distance, standing under our covered porch, sipping coffee. "She thought she could crush us with concrete," Beth said softly, eyes locked on the sinking neighborhood. But she ended up sinking herself. By the end of the week, several homeowners had filed formal complaints against the HOA, citing property damage, negligence, and mishandling of funds. City inspectors issued multiple violation notices. Karen's name, once spoken with wary respect, was now muttered with anger and resentment. It was strange, standing at the edge of all this destruction, knowing we hadn't lifted a single stone or poured a single bucket of water. All we'd done was expose the truth and let it take its course. Beth slipped her hand into mine, squeezing gently. "You know what the best part is?" she whispered. I smiled faintly. "What?" She leaned in just a bit, her eyes glinting. "We're not even finished yet." The courtroom was packed on the day the final decision came down. Local reporters had shown up, eager to cover the fallout after the flooding disaster, and I could feel their eyes darting between us and Karen as we waited for the judge to take her seat. Beth sat next to me, calm but laser-focused, flipping through her notes one last time. Across the aisle, Karen looked like a shadow of the woman we'd first confronted months ago. Her perfect blazer rumpled, her hands twitching restlessly, her once stony expression cracked into something close to panic. She whispered furiously to her lawyers, who didn't seem to have much comfort left to offer. The judge cleared her throat. "We have reached a ruling." I felt my heart hammering as she spoke, but Beth stayed steady, her shoulders back, her chin lifted. The judge recounted the key points of the case: the illegal destruction of private property, the unauthorized actions of the HOA, the retaliatory motives behind the so-called beautification mandate, the environmental negligence that had led to the neighborhood's flooding. Then came the words we'd been waiting for. The defendants are hereby ordered to pay the plaintiffs, Matthew and Elizabeth Harper, a sum of $1,500,000 in damages and compensation, including legal costs, property restoration, and emotional distress. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Beside me, Beth's fingers closed around mine tightly, her eyes shining but fierce. But it wasn't over yet. The judge turned to the HOA board members seated beside Karen and made it clear that the city's investigation into their activities would continue, that new oversight would be imposed, and that further sanctions could follow. And then, to Karen directly, "Given the overwhelming evidence of personal misconduct, you are hereby removed from your position as HOA president, effective immediately." Karen's face crumpled. For the first time, she didn't look smug, didn't look superior. She looked small. Beth rose calmly when the session ended, shaking Gina's hand firmly, thanking her. As we stepped outside, flashes from cameras caught us off guard. Reporters pressing in with questions, eager to get a statement. Beth offered them a brief, measured smile. "All we ever wanted," she said softly, "was to be left alone to care for our home, our land, and our garden. We fought because we had no choice. And now we'll rebuild." That night, sitting together on the back porch, I watched Beth as she sipped her wine, her gaze soft as she looked over the damaged but still standing garden. "We did it," I murmured. She smiled, resting her head briefly against my shoulder. "No, Matt," she whispered. "We won." A year later, if you stood on the edge of our property and looked across the garden, you'd never believe it had once been buried under cold gray concrete. Beth's vision had returned. No, not just returned, transcended. Where there had been broken rose bushes, now stretched elegant rows of rare blooms from around the world. Where the statues had been shattered, graceful new sculptures stood, commissioned by local artists who had heard our story and wanted to be part of the revival. The stone fountain in the center had been replaced with a masterpiece, a cascading water feature that glimmered under soft garden lights, the sound of the water filling the night air with peace. I sat on our back porch that evening, a glass of wine in hand, watching Beth walk slowly through the pathways she had rebuilt, her fingertips brushing gently over blossoms and leaves. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with pink and gold, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Deep, bone-deep satisfaction. Neighbors had started coming by more often, not to complain or to gossip, but to admire. They brought friends, asked Beth for advice on their own yards, sometimes even hired her for redesigns. She'd become something of a local legend, the woman who not only survived a war with the HOA, but came out victorious, more respected and admired than ever. And Maple Hill, well, their world was different now. With Karen gone, the HOA was under entirely new leadership. The board had been forced to undergo reforms, and the city had kept them under a microscope ever since the flooding disaster. Some residents sold their homes and left, frustrated by the mess, while others stayed and tried to pick up the pieces. The once pristine streets now showed signs of wear, but honestly, I couldn't bring myself to care. Sometimes, when I passed the old HOA clubhouse, I'd catch a glimpse of Karen through a window, hunched over papers. No longer the queen bee, just another resident, her reputation in tatters. We never spoke again after the court case, and I didn't plan to change that. Beth climbed the porch steps and eased into the chair beside me, exhaling softly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, gazing out at her creation. I smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "It's more than beautiful. It's a victory." She laughed quietly, resting her head against my shoulder. "You know," she said, "sometimes I wonder what they think when they look over here, the ones who tried to ruin us." I chuckled. "They probably think they picked the wrong people to mess with." Beth turned to me, her eyes shining with a playful glint. "Damn right they did." We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the soft splash of the fountain, the chirping of crickets, the occasional distant bark of a dog. The air smelled of roses and night jasmine, a reminder of everything we'd fought for and reclaimed. As the last light faded, I realized something I hadn't put into words before. It wasn't just the garden that had been reborn. We had been too. Not broken, not bitter, but stronger, sharper, ready for whatever came next. I took a slow sip of wine and smiled to myself. They say you should never underestimate the power of a determined woman. I knew that better than anyone.